Good morning, everyone. How are you? This lecture will be for Wednesday, May 27th. Remember, we're going to wrap up 50s and 60s today and tomorrow, and we will test 50s, 60s, and Cold War on Friday of this week, which is the 29th. Okay, so that's the way the rest of our week looks. And then we have 2 weeks of 5 days coming up. We will do a persuasive paper for the middle of the last week, and that will be your last grade of the fourth quarter and of the year. So remember, there's no final coming to you this year. So each quarter would typically be worth 22.5% times 4, which is 90, and the final would be 10. We don't have that this year, so each quarter is going to be worth 25% times 4 is 100%, and that is going to be your grade for your junior year U.S. history. All right. So we're going to push into the 1960s today. We've been talking about the 1950s. Some of the highlights there are economic prosperity, further rise of the standard of living and consumer culture, the building of suburbia, and departure from the cities, the effects of the GI Bill, which is education and homes, opportunities for returning veterans, the beginning of the civil rights movement, Brown v. the Board of Education, the desegregation of schools, the Montgomery bus boycott, and the desegregation of public transportation. So the civil rights movement is in complete kick-up mode at this point. You got the beatnik generation, which is the precursor to the hippies. And now we're starting to turn our way into the 1960s. So you had two Eisenhower administrations, 52 and 56. He's a Republican. And then in the election of 1960, you're going to have Eisenhower's vice president, who is Republican Richard Nixon, versus Democrat John F. Kennedy. Richard Nixon is a California Republican, cut his teeth on the House on Un-American Affairs activities, and then became vice president. Pretty popular guy. Versus John F. Kennedy, who's a World War II veteran, son of a bootlegger, and I think that his father served as British ambassador. I forget under what. I think under FDR, perhaps. But his family had political ties as well. And he is going to be the first Catholic president and only Catholic president that will ever be elected in this country. I think he might even be the second Catholic to ever run for the presidency. I know Alfred Smith ran, I think, in 1928 against Hoover and lost. And Kennedy is going to win by a very, very slim margin. All right. What else here? Now, we've talked throughout the year about a Protestant fear of Catholics, that Catholics would be loyal to the Vatican and the Pope and Rome before they would ever identify with a government or a president in a free and democratic country. Now, that was largely a false claim. And I mean, you all know many Catholics today. I don't know many that look to the Pope first and our government second for leadership. They're kind of separate in their mind. One's legal and safety based and law based, and the other is moral and righteous and, pathway to heaven based, if you will. All right. But there's that out there. You will see some anti-Catholic rhetoric against JFK. Remember that the Catholics are still a minority in this country. There's about 60 or 65 million. So that's about 1 in every 5 or 6 Americans is a Catholic. Doesn't feel that way on Long Island and in New York, in the tri-state area where there are a lot of Catholics. But out there in the rest of the country, it's slim pickings. All right. Now, both come out with strong rhetoric against the Soviet Union and against communism. This was not an us versus them political thing. You were all basically mainstream politics and majority politics was strong rhetoric against the Soviets and against communism, which meant the continuing buildup of the military, the continuing expansion of UN influence around the world, and that you were willing to compete and race with whatever the Russians wanted to do. So if they wanted to get to space, we wanted to get to space first. If they wanted to build a bigger nuclear weapon, we would build a bigger nuclear weapon and more of them than them. So we are going to still see this race towards supremacy, if you will, from both of these candidates. Now, interestingly, this is going to be the first televised presidential debate. And I don't know if you know what Richard Nixon looks like. I'm not saying that he is an ugly man, but he certainly doesn't look as good as John F. Kennedy does. So John F. Kennedy is young and energetic and exuberant and vibrant. And the TV is really going to pick up on that kind of smooth energy that he has. Now, we all know debates, you guys probably watched them in maybe 2012 and definitely in 2016, where the presidential candidates square off against each other. And it tells a lot about who these people are. I mean, you can see them answering the questions, sweating it out, how they smile, how they cough, how they fidget, how they move. You can pick up a lot about a person by watching them speak in front of large groups of people, how they react to different questions, how they react to the pressure. So JFK is really going to get a leg up on Nixon through this first televised presidential debate. And supposedly Nixon was sick and he wasn't feeling well. He had like a cold going into this debate. So he looks sweaty, he looks nervous, he looks quiet, he looks timid. And then you have JFK just kind of smoothly answering the questions. And JFK is going to win this, one of the closest elections in the history of the country. 70 million votes were cast. JFK wins by only 120,000 votes. So it's super razor thin. Let's check out this video here on the Kennedy debate.
Thank you, Mr. Nixon. That completes the opening statements, and now the candidates will answer questions or comment upon one another's answers to questions put by correspondents of the networks. The correspondents.
I'm Sander Van Oker, NBC News.
I'm Charles Warren, Mutual News.
I'm Stuart Nogan, CBS News.
Bob Fleming, ABC News.
The first question to Senator Kennedy from Mr. Fleming.
Senator, the Vice President in his campaign has said that you are naive and at times immature. He has raised the question of leadership. On this issue, why do you think people should vote for you rather than the Vice President?
Well, the Vice President and I came to the Congress together. 1946, we both served in the Labor Committee. I've been there now for 14 years, the same period of time that he has. So that our experience in government is comparable. Secondly, I think the question is, what are the programs that we advocate? What is the party record that we lead? I come out of the Democratic Party, which in this century has produced Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, and which supported and sustained these programs which I've discussed tonight. Mr. Nixon comes out of the Republican Party. He was nominated by it. And it is a fact that through most of these last 25 years, the Republican leadership has opposed federal aid for education, medical care for the aged, development of the Tennessee Valley, development of our natural resources. I think Mr. Nixon is an effective leader of his party. I hope he would grant me the same. The question before us is, which point of view and which party do we want to lead the United States?
Mr. Nixon, would you like to comment on that statement?
I have no comment.
The next question to Vice President Nixon from Mr. Van Oker.
Mr. Vice President, since the question of executive leadership is a very important campaign issue, I'd like to follow Mr. Novan's question. Now, Republican campaign slogans, you'll see them on signs around the country as we did last week, say, it's experience that counts. That's over a picture of yourself, sir. Implying that you've had more governmental executive decision-making experience than your opponent. Now, in his news conference on August 24th, President Eisenhower was asked to give one example of a major idea of yours that he adopted. His reply was, and I'm quoting, "If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember." Now, that was a month ago, sir, and the president hasn't brought it up since. And I'm wondering, sir, if you can clarify which version is correct, the one put out by Republican campaign leaders or the one put out by President Eisenhower?
Well, I would suggest, Mr. Van Oker, that if you know the president, that was probably a facetious remark. I would also suggest that insofar as his statement is concerned, that I think it would be improper for the President of the United States to disclose the instances in which members of his official family had made recommendations, as I have made them through the years, to him which he has accepted or rejected. The President has always maintained, and very properly so, that he is entitled to get what advice he wants from his cabinet and from his other advisors without disclosing that to anybody, including, as a matter of fact, the Congress. Now, I can only say this. Through the years, I have sat in the National Security Council. I have been in the cabinet. I have met with the legislative leaders. I have met with the president when he made the great decisions with regard to Lebanon, Kimoy Matsu, other matters. The president has asked for my advice. I have given it. Sometimes my advice has been taken. Sometimes it is not. I do not say that I have made the decisions. And I would say that no president should ever allow anybody else to make the major decisions. The president only makes the decisions. All that his advisors do is to give counsel when he asks for it. As far as what experience counts and whether that is experience that counts, that isn't for me to say.
All right, so I just wanted to give you a little hint of what they both looked like and sounded like. I don't know if you would agree that Kennedy looks a little bit more aggressive and cool, calm, collected there. Definitely has a little bit more of an upbeat way of speaking, a little more photogenic, a little more calm looking. You can kind of see Nixon's posture a little bit, and it's crazy. Like, wait until the 2020 debates that are coming, as long as they happen in person. You have these like body language psychologists that come out after the debates and talk about how they were standing, how they hunched their shoulders, how they arched their heads and their back, how they clenched their fists, whether they looked like to be perspiring, all in trying to come up with a psychological profile on these candidates. So televised debates really going to change the landscape and our interaction, our engagement with our politicians. This is going to be the map. All right, so the blue is going to be Kennedy and the red is going to be California. All right, and we see some anomalies here, like New York and basically the Cotton Belt South is still voting Democrat, so things haven't fully switched over yet. Texas and New York voting the same way, and New York and California voting an opposite way. Now remember that Nixon is from California, so it does make sense that he would win that state. Here's JFK. Now, the 50s had a healthy amount of protest. The 60s is going to make that number exponentially bigger. And if the 60s is known for one thing, it is this rising tide of protest. All right. Now, the main things that are going to be protested is not consumerism and materialism as much as it's going to be civil rights because of segregation and then the Vietnam War. So you are going to see a lot of overlap in the protest movements between civil rights and the Vietnam War. Vietnam War will be more mid to later 60s, whereas the civil rights stuff will be throughout the 60s, but that's going to be a continuation from the 1950s, okay? So if you remember us talking about various labor tactics for unionization, boycotting, all right? Now remember, MLK's mantra is civil disobedience, peaceful protest, okay? So you don't be the aggressor, you let them be the aggressor. You just say what you need to say and you have the right to protest per the First Amendment. So if you remember, we talked about the GM auto plant back in the 1920s, 1930s, where the workers just decided to sit down on the factory floor, and it was a peaceful way of protesting. You weren't out there fighting with the police and throwing rocks and making a big ruckus. You were just quietly sitting down. All right. Now we're going to see this for the civil rights movement as young black people are going to sit down in colleges, in the historically black colleges, as well as at lunch counters, in bus stations, on the sides of roads. They are going to sit down and protest segregation in general. All right. The fact that they have to be at a historically black college because black people were not allowed into white colleges. The fact that not only can they not eat at a white lunch counter, which is like a diner to us, okay, but they can't work there either. So every place that blacks couldn't be served, blacks couldn't work most of the time either. So it created not only separation based upon race, but also segregation or separation for employment based upon race. All right. And I have a picture of the sit-ins here. Okay. Now the Freedom Rides, these were groups of, and the other thing about the sit-ins is that this thing was contagious. So when white people at the University of Chicago or University of Michigan or Cal Berkeley heard that black people in the South were doing sit-ins as a form of peaceful protest, they started doing the same thing as well. They started sitting down in their campus union buildings. They started sitting down in their classrooms, all in this sort of peaceful, rather silent way of protesting the social conditions in the country. All right. Now, the Freedom Rides, integrated groups traveling by bus into Deep South to test compliance with court orders banning segregation on interstate buses and trains where violent mobs were assaulting them. Now, this was like throwing the bait out into the water. So coordinated groups of young white and black people were getting on buses, on Greyhounds, and I forget the name of the other bus company, and riding through different portions of the South looking to challenge the laws of segregation. Now, they were met with police brutality. They were met with Ku Klux Klan. I forget what city it was, but the Klan actually jumped onto the bus and beat the people up and moved them to the back of the bus. And the police were not called to let the Klan kind of do their work. All right. So, again, this is more aggressive, but it is still peaceful. They're just riding on a bus. They're trying to prove a point that white and black people should be able to live together. Or live together, work together, eat together, whatever it is. They are protesting segregation, and they are testing, because the more arrests there are, the more court cases there will be. And the idea is that if the people won't elect leaders who will change the laws of segregation, all right, then just like the Supreme Court with Brown v. the Board of Ed, the more the courts get involved, these types of people believe will be a benefit for civil rights. All right. Now, I want to watch this video, which is about Bull Connor. And Bull Connor is a mayoral candidate and a police commissioner in Birmingham, Alabama. And he's going to deal with MLK and his protesters. He's going to deal with these freedom rides. And he becomes like enemy number one for the desegregation forces. He becomes the voice of institutional racism in this country and the old guard. And they use him basically to drum up their cause and create an enemy out there that this was the face of evil. This was the face of racism. So let's watch this.
You can never whip these bugs if you don't keep you and them separate. I found that out in Birmingham. You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
In May of 1963, one individual in Birmingham, Alabama, reinvigorated the wilting civil rights movement. Bull Connor, Birmingham's Commissioner of Public Safety, ordered the use of fire hoses and police dogs to quell demonstrations pushing for desegregation in Birmingham. In an ironic twist, however, by defending segregation so fervently, Bull Connor actually called national attention to the civil rights movement and dramatized its goals. His violent actions brought the immediate end to segregation in Birmingham, solidified his legacy as a symbol of bigotry, and, most importantly, hastened the passage of major civil rights legislation. Starting in the 1950s, dramatic changes began to sweep the entire nation. Following the landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 and the success of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956, America found itself amidst an ever-strengthening civil rights movement. In 1962, however, the movement met its first significant setback in Albany, Georgia. The Albany movement was largely a failure. Because it lacked a clear-cut focus and failed to arouse an aggressive response from the police department, the campaign stalled. In August of 1962, the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., left the city of Albany. According to King, the Albany movement's aims were so vague that we got nothing, and the people were left depressed and in despair. Although King left Albany crestfallen, he quickly refocused his attention on finding a way to regain momentum. King and other civil rights leaders sought someone that would display to the world the grim reality of segregation in the South. It didn't take long to find such an individual. Born in 1897, Theophilus Eugene Connor achieved local fame in Birmingham after dropping out of high school and becoming a baseball radio announcer in 1921. Due to his booming voice, Connor earned the nickname Bull, and eventually became, according to one publication, one of Dixie's most popular announcers. In 1934, Bull Connor launched his career in politics by becoming a member of the Alabama House of Representatives. According to Connor, he ran partly for the fun of it and partly to see how many friends I had. Despite his superficial motives and modest beginnings, Connor eventually would become one of the most infamous men in the South. By 1963, Connor had already gained his reputation for defending segregation at all costs. Over the past 2 decades, he had dominated Birmingham's political scene. Serving as the Commissioner of Public Safety, Connor controlled both the police department and the fire department. Connor frequently used his power to enforce Birmingham's stringent segregation ordinances, or, as he referred to them, our way of life. Bull Connor's Birmingham had become an international symbol of segregation and racism. The city was referred to as Bombingham for the numerous unsolved bombings by the Ku Klux Klan during Connor's reign. In 1962, Connor ordered the closure of over 60 of Birmingham's parks rather than follow a court's order to desegregate public facilities. According to Dr. King, Birmingham was the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. After the failure of the Albany movement, local civil rights leaders implored Dr. King to make Birmingham the next target of the civil rights movement. The Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth told King, "If you come to Birmingham, the movement can not only gain prestige, it can really shake the country." With such a strong incentive, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference began planning for the campaign in Birmingham. It would be called Project C, for confrontation.
I have the feeling that if we can get a breakthrough in Birmingham and really break down the walls of segregation, it will demonstrate to the whole South, at least the hardcore South, that it can no longer resist integration.
Since African Americans comprise 40% of the consumer population in Birmingham, the SCLC decided to target segregation primarily in the business section of the city through economic boycott and prolonged demonstrations. The leaders of Project C also hoped that it would serve as a template for future resistances in southern cities. According to Shuttlesworth, we wanted confrontation, nonviolent confrontation, to see if it would work on a massive scale, not just for Birmingham, for the nation. After small-scale demonstrations in April, the leaders of Project C decided to use a revolutionary new tactic. The final phase of the movement would focus on mobilizing hundreds of Birmingham's youth. On Thursday, May 2nd, the first children began demonstrating. By the end of the day, Bull Connor and his police force had arrested 959 children, ranging from ages 6 to 18. Over the next few days, Connor continued defending segregation at all costs.
Do you think you can keep Birmingham in the present situation of segregation?
I may not be able to do it, but I'll die trying.
Connor ordered his police and fire departments to use dogs and hoses to crush these massive demonstrations. To counter King's tactic of nonviolence, Connor pledged to fill the jails. By May 7th, Connor and his police department had already jailed over 3,000 demonstrators. The situation in Birmingham worsened as Connor proceeded with his relentless attack on the demonstrators. Local business leaders began to change their minds about segregation. Because of the economically crippling effect of the boycott and the state of race relations, the Senior Citizens Committee, a group that represented the majority of Birmingham's businesses, agreed to desegregate lunch counters and hire African American workers. Announced on May 10th, the Birmingham Agreement struck an enormous blow for integration. Bull Connor's extreme actions had clearly backfired, but his violent actions would eventually backfire even more.
Bull Connor's recalcitrant behavior and positions allowed the press to be able to focus thoroughly on what was happening within a movement experience.
Over 200 reporters from local and national media outlets captured Connor's segregationist tactics in pictures and video. The stark contrast of vicious dogs and high-powered hoses with young children dramatically stirred the nation's conscience. As Connor attacked the Birmingham Agreement as capitulation by certain weak-kneed white people, President John F. Kennedy began preparing for a monumental address to the nation. Previously, Kennedy had taken a rather lackluster stance on civil rights for African Americans. However, Bull Connor's alarming actions in Birmingham had alerted Kennedy, along with millions of other Americans, of the dire situation in the South. On June 11, 1963, Kennedy delivered an address on civil rights to the nation.
Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. Speak, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
Using the momentum from the events in Birmingham, over 250,000 Americans participated in the March on Washington in August of 1963, rallying behind a cry to pass the bill. A year later, President Lyndon Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The act, which was originally proposed because of Bull Connor's aggressive defense of segregation, outlawed segregation in schools, public places, and employment, and was an enormous step towards equality between different races.
All right, so let's end that there. That video is really good to kind of show you some of the optics and the visuals of what was going on. So you see that, they targeted Birmingham, and they were looking for a guy like Bull Connor, who they knew would do anything at any cost to stop, the end of segregation. So they targeted Birmingham. They wanted the media there. They put the children out front to get arrested in big numbers. I mean, it's one thing watching a dog or a fire hose on an adult, but seeing it on a child is definitely going to be more effective in changing the American conscience. And with MLK being the top civil rights leader in our country's history, it was the peaceful protest idea with the TV and the media coverage that really forced the politicians like a JFK or a Lyndon B. Johnson to take notice and to put pressure on them to do something about it. Because, we've talked all year about different mediums and different pieces of technology. The picture, the camera took words and put it into an image. And the radio kind of sped that up a little bit, but the TV is going to explode what an image can do, because the way it makes you feel, the emotional impact that it can have on you as a result of this now moving image of real life, can really change the way people look at the world and change attitudes and belief systems. All right. And all of this in Birmingham, like they were showing there at the end of that video, is going to push us into the March on Washington, where 250,000 people are going to meet on the National Mall between the Capitol building and the Washington Monument in protest and in support, protest of segregation and in support of the civil rights movement. So we got the sit-ins, we got the freedom rides, and that's the March on Washington there in 1963. Now, let's talk a little bit about the rest of Kennedy's administration. We all know that Kennedy is going to be assassinated in 1963, so he is going to basically have a little less than 3 years in office. All right, little actual accomplishments, domestic and foreign. It's weird because he didn't do much. He's only in there for 3 years, but he stood for something, sort of this youthful, hopeful, energetic enthusiasm about the country that people were really drawn to. Very magnetic politician, JFK. Creates the Peace Corps, which still exists today, aiding people abroad, improving the image of the United States. Thousands of young people are going to join with their energy and their idealism. So perhaps you went to college and then you joined the Peace Corps, or perhaps you went out and looked for an experience, because remember, college is expensive. It's not for everybody at this time, like it, more so like it is today. So you wanted to see the world, you wanted an experience, you wanted some, real world experience. So you were going to join the Peace Corps and get out there. And this is not a military unit. This is someone that goes to help on vaccinations in Africa, or helps build houses or bridges in a certain part of the world. So it's a PR mission for improved status of American relations, and also the idea that, democratic capitalism is also charitable and wanting to, help the rest of the world. Now, he's going to get in big time trouble when it comes to Cold War and containment. Now, Cuba is 90 miles off the coast of Miami, so it is super close to the United States. And Fidel Castro and his Cuban revolutionaries, if you will, are going to take over and overthrow a nationalist government that is backed by United States business interests and politicians. I forget what year. I believe it's somewhere in the late 1950s. So that is going to be a people's uprising of communists and socialists in Cuba. They're going to take over the Cuban island and the Cuban government and instill a communist regime. All right. That means no free press, no freedom of religion, no right to bear arms, and all of the other Soviet ideas that kind of fly in the face of what we're doing here in America. Now, this is going to flip out the hardcore Cold Warriors, because now 90 miles off the coast of Florida, you have a potential Soviet ally right in our backyard, right in our neck of the woods, that could possibly launch an attack on the United States from there, or launch a nuclear weapon or a missile or whatever it is going to be. So there's going to be a CIA covert operation to storm the island and work with Cuban nationalists there to take over the country and get rid of Castro and the communist government there. And it is going to be a complete disaster, because I don't know how, but Castro is going to get tipped off that this kind of covert operation is coming. They're going to thwart the operation, and Kennedy is going to have big time egg on his face, because it looks like, it's not supposed to look like the United States is doing it, but it clearly is them, and backed by the CIA. Castro is able to kind of use this as not only propaganda, but just fact that they're a sovereign country, and now they're being attacked by the United States. So the Soviets and the Cubans are going to work together in further pissing off the United States, saying that they're not the aggressors. The United States was, by trying to remove Castro in a sovereign country, and now Cuba is going to be armed by the Soviet Union. All right. Now, America is going to have a big time reaction to this, because now it's 90 miles off the shores. You pissed off Cuba. You failed in removing Castro. Now the Soviets are involved. Now they're giving them missiles. So what Kennedy's plan is going to be to circle with their navy the island of Cuba, to not allow weapons and supplies from the Soviets to be able to go into Cuba, so they can't get weapons to be able to potentially launch them at the United States. So this is a big time escalation of Cold War, and it's really the closest that Cold War fear actually comes to America, being that Cuba is so close for an attack against us. So he wades in the waters of containment quickly, 1962 into 63. It doesn't work. It winds up being a PR disaster for Kennedy. He's made to look soft and ineffective. The Cubans and the Soviets kind of won this little chess battle in this larger Cold War. So that is also going to be part of his shift towards domestic civil rights. And he's going to say or believe that he can make more good in the country by focusing on civil rights than by getting involved in foreign entanglements. All right. Now, he is going to be assassinated on November 22nd of 1963. My parents are 21 and 19 when this happened. And it's sort of like their 9/11 moment and Pearl Harbor for the generation before them. You're never going to forget where you were when that happened, and it brought the country together in this sort of national mourning, that this young and energetic president gets shot in the head in a convertible in Dallas, okay, in some sort of presidential procession. I'm not exactly sure what they were doing there. I won't get into all the conspiracy theories as to who killed him and why. Nobody seems to have ever really agreed on why he was killed, but he is going to be the last president that has been assassinated, okay? This is just a New York Times front page on the Cuba crisis. That's Fidel Castro. And that is JFK's The Eternal Flame at his tomb, which is in Arlington Cemetery outside of Washington, D.C. It's right over the bridge into Virginia, and that flame never goes out. I don't know if any of you have been there. I have been there. It's a relatively sad sight, I would say, and if you do get down to D.C., you should get into the cemetery. Now, when one president gets assassinated, his vice president is going to become the president. So Lyndon B. Johnson, a.k.a. LBJ, is going to become the president. He is from the poor central area of Texas. And we're going to talk about him the rest of today and a little bit tomorrow. He's got a very good domestic record and a not so great foreign record. The foreign record, not so great because he escalates Vietnam, and we all know what Vietnam winds up turning into. He largely gets the blame for that, but he is going to continue the work of prior Democrats in pushing for more civil rights legislation. So the March on Washington is going to wind up turning into successful legislation in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So rather than go town by town, city by city, state by state, this is now the federal government banning discrimination in schools, hospitals, employment, restaurants, hotels, and theaters. That's not just for one location, that's for all locations. So 1964, 100 years earlier, they're ending the Civil War, ending slavery, and passing equal protection under the law, the 14th Amendment. It took another 100 years for the federal government to pass this Civil Rights Act, which actually says, well, now we intend to enforce that equal protection under the law. So the 14th Amendment is going to get further validated and solidified and acted upon by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And if you also see here, we're starting to move into the private sector. So the federal government is moving into the homes and businesses, if you will, of not so much the homes, but let's say the businesses, the private businesses of citizens, where they believe if they want to have the right to say no to you coming into their store, they should have to. The federal government is going to say no to this. And it starts to kick up the word discrimination. So the idea that you cannot be separated or discriminated against based upon race is going to start to hold. And of course, that's going to lead into where we are today, which is where you can't discriminate based on race, religion, age, gender, or disability. All right. Now, sexuality is part of the discrimination acts in certain states, but I don't believe it is federally applied as of yet. 1964, LBJ is going to win his first election, defeating Barry Goldwater. Goldwater's ideas are going to catch on to create a new conservative movement and coalition in the South, the Southwest, and the middle-class suburbs. So Barry Goldwater is largely thought to be the pioneer or the father of what you know of the Republican Party today. So you can draw a line from Barry Goldwater to Richard Nixon to Ronald Reagan to the Bushes. All right. I don't know that we can put Trump in the Barry Goldwater light. I'm sure there is some overlap. But if you look at where Trump won, he won southern states, he won southwestern states, and I think he won a lot of middle-class suburbs. For example, on Long Island, I think Hillary won Nassau and he won Suffolk. So it was pretty split. All right. But we're going to start to see over these next few elections, the Republicans starting to hold the South more than ever and pushing us into where we are today, which is mostly a blue North and West Coast and a red South and middle of the country. All right. Now, another one of his major domestic achievements is the 1965 Voting Rights Act. All right. MLK marches on Selma to Montgomery. We have more violence. We have more police brutality. We have more civil unrest. We have more bad news coverage. And this is going to force the hand to pass the Voting Rights Act, which is going to be the unwinding of the poll tax and the literacy test and the grandfather clause. They're also going to pass a 24th Amendment changing the Constitution to outlaw the poll tax, which, if you remember, was if you could afford to pay a certain amount of money, then you could vote. All right. So 1964 Civil Rights Act helps to strengthen the 14th Amendment. 1965 Voting Rights Act helps to reinforce and validate the 15th Amendment. So we're working like 90 to 100 years after already their intended purpose failed and state and really federal government allowed it to go on for another 90 to 100 years after the Civil War ended. We are now, because of the Civil Rights Act of movement of Martin Luther King and others, all right, that is going to force the federal government's hand to basically tell the southern states what to do. You must not discriminate based upon race, and you will not deny them the right to vote. All right. He's also going to create his Great Society programs, Medicare, which is old age insurance. So in this country, at the age of 65 or older, no matter who you are, how rich or how poor, white or black, what religion you are, you get federal health benefits for the rest of your life. It's expensive. Think about it. The federal government basically takes over healthcare when a person gets to be their oldest and their sickest. All right. But the idea there is that you're no longer working. So you're going to lose your health insurance from your employer, because why would your employer pay for your health insurance if you're not working for them anymore? And now you're going to be on federal help. Medicaid is health insurance for poor people. So if you make under a certain amount of money in this country, or if you're on disability, you can get approved for Medicaid. Now, Medicaid is not nearly as controversial, or excuse me, is much more controversial than Medicare. Because if you ask most people, hey, is it right for the federal government to give health insurance to old people? Many people would say yes. And then if you said, well, is it right for the federal government to give health care to poor people? Now we got questions to ask. Well, are they just lazy? Did they fall on hard times? Couldn't they get an education? Can't they just get a job? And then we get into this whole debate on disability and welfare and food stamps and things like that. All right. There will be more state funding for education. There will be more state funding for urban development. Okay. And there will be a war on poverty, which is what we know of today as food stamps. Now, some people would say that if you don't have enough money to buy food and the government gave you enough money to buy food or gave you food directly, that that is a good thing. There are other people that say that person should just go and get a job and make money to buy their own food. Now, we can debate this back and forth time and time again, and it will continue to be debated. These programs exist as a safety net. So if you were to fall on hard times, you get unemployment benefits, you get food stamps, you possibly get Medicaid in case you get sick. The idea is to keep you alive while you then go and fix the situation and pick yourself back up. Now, unemployment runs out in most states in 6 to 9 months, and then you don't get unemployment benefits anymore. I don't know what the requirements are for food stamps and Medicaid. I don't know if you can permanently be on them. I do know that with unemployment, they do check in weekly with you to make sure that you're looking for work. What interviews have you been on? It isn't, I don't think, so cut and dry as, hey, I don't have a job, give me money. There are definitely hoops that people have to jump through in order to get these programs. I know that Medicare and Medicaid are very expensive. I don't think the government spends much on food stamps. I think it's something like less than 0.5% of 1% of our budget actually gets spent on that. I know that we have all seen somebody in the grocery store either buying beer with food stamps and then getting into a luxury car. We all have a story like that. But I would imagine that the majority of people on food stamps are people that are certainly poor and are spending their money on the things that are essential for them. So again, it's a debate that will continue to go on. But this is all part of his Great Society programs of LBJ. And that is a picture of LB. And let us end there for today. Sorry I kept you a little long. Those videos were a little longer. My bad. I hope you're all doing well. I'll get this up on Edpuzzle, and I'll speak to you guys soon. Thanks.